There is a number at the center of this war that nobody in the Pentagon briefing room, nobody on cable news, and nobody in the White House press corps is talking about with the seriousness it deserves. That number is 363. It is a ratio, and understanding what it represents is the single most important thing you can do to understand what Iran is actually doing to the United States right now. Because the story of this war that you are being told is a story about American military power, about stealth aircraft and precision munitions and 5,000 targets struck in less than 2 weeks. That story is real. It is also incomplete in a way that Iran's military strategists understood long before the first bomb fell. And the part of the story that is missing, the part that explains why Ali Laurani looked at the most powerful military in the history of the world and said those who have tried to eliminate our nation have become eradicated themselves, is sitting inside that ratio. 363 to 1, that is the cost of one Iranian Shahed-136 attack drone divided into the cost of one American THAAD interceptor missile. The Shahed cost $35,000 to build. The THAAD cost $12.7 million to shoot it down. Iran is spending $35,000. The United States is spending $12.7 million every single time. And Iran built 2,000 of them for the opening salvo alone. Do that math, and you will understand that what Iran is running is not a military campaign in any traditional sense. It is an economic demolition. And it was designed methodically and deliberately long before February 28th to work exactly the way it is working right now. Start with what this war is actually costing, because the numbers are staggering and they are getting almost no sustained attention. The Center for Strategic and International Studies calculated that the first 100 hours of Operation Epic Fury cost $3.7 billion. That is $891 million per day. For context, the Iraq war at its most expensive peak cost $300 million per day. The Iran campaign is running at 3 times the peak Iraq rate. The Penn-Wharton budget model, one of the most respected independent fiscal analysis institutions in the United States, projects that a 2-month conflict at current intensity will cost between $40 and $95 billion in direct military expenditure alone. And its total economic impact estimate, accounting for energy disruption, inflation, supply chain damage, and financial market volatility, reaches $210 billion. The Pentagon has already sent a $50 billion emergency supplemental budget request to Congress just to replace the Tomahawk and Patriot missiles and THAAD interceptors consumed in the first week of the war. The first week, Jennifer Kavanaugh of Defense Priorities estimated the United States spent more than $10 billion on air defense systems alone in the first 48 hours. $10 billion in 2 days. And all of this is landing on top of a federal government that, according to the Congressional Budget Office, was already projected to run a $1.9 trillion deficit in fiscal year 2026 before a single bomb was dropped. National debt has now crossed $38.5 trillion. Interest payments on that debt will total nearly $17 trillion between now and 2036, rising from over $1 trillion annually today to over $2 trillion by 2035. The United States was financially stretched before this war. This war is stretching it further faster in ways that the fiscal math makes genuinely alarming. But here's the thing about those numbers that you need to understand. They describe the cost of the war to the United States. They do not describe the cost of the war to Iran. And that asymmetry is not an accident. It is the strategy. Iran has been building this strategy for over a decade, watching how the United States responded to the Iraq war, watching what happened in Ukraine when Russian drone swarms met Western air defenses, watching the 2022 energy crisis reveal how exposed the global economy is to energy supply shocks, and drawing a set of conclusions that the Atlantic Council, the Center for a New American Security, and CNAS have all in analyses published in the last week described with the same word, deliberate. Iran's military doctrine, as it has been practiced in this conflict, is built on one foundational insight. The United States has built the most expensive, most sophisticated, most technically capable military machine in human history. And the way to defeat it is not to match it. It is to make it too expensive to use. Every cheap drone that forces an expensive interceptor creates a cost imbalance that compounds over time. Every day the Strait of Hormuz stays closed, drives oil prices higher, which drives inflation higher, which drives political pressure on the government higher, which shortens the political timeline available for military operations. Every week of conflict consumes weapons stockpiles that take months or years to replace. Iran does not need to win militarily. It needs to make winning militarily cost more than the United States is willing to pay. And right now, on day 12 of Operation Epic Fury, The evidence suggests it is executing that plan with considerable effectiveness. The interceptor stockpile problem is the most acute, immediate expression of this strategy, and it is the part of this war that the analysts who study it most carefully describe as genuinely alarming. Here is the situation. The Heritage Foundation published a report in January 2026, before the war began, warning that high-end interceptors, including the SM-3, the SM-6, the Patriot PAC-3 MSE, and the THAAD, would likely be exhausted within days of sustained combat against a peer adversary, with some systems depleted after just 2 or 3 major salvos. That report was describing a hypothetical conflict with China. And then 1 month later, the United States began burning through those exact interceptor stockpiles in a real conflict with Iran. CSIS estimates that by the end of the June 2025 12-day war, the United States had already expended up to 30% of its THAAD stockpile. Now, in the current conflict, CSIS estimates that between 20 and 50% of the entire remaining U.S. THAAD inventory may have been expended. The U.S. Army has requested enough Patriot interceptors to reach a total of 13,773 missiles. Its current production rate is between 6 and 650 interceptors per year. Even if production were quadrupled, replacing 150 THAAD interceptors would take nearly 5 months. And 4 former senior U.S. defense officials told reporters this week that the stockpile problem is most acute in exactly the systems that are the critical foundation of deterrence against China in the Indo-Pacific. The weapons America is burning in Iran are the weapons it would need to defend Taiwan. That is where the strategic picture becomes genuinely alarming in a way that extends far beyond the Iran war itself. Professor Steve Tong, the director of the SOAS China Institute at the University of London, asked the question that is now being discussed in classified briefings in every major capital. Will she be tempted to take advantage of U.S. potentially exhausting smart munitions and attack Taiwan, even if the PLA is not fully ready? Time magazine reported that during a closed-door briefing between senior Trump administration officials and members of Congress on March 3rd, questions about U.S. weapons reserves dominated the conversation. CNAS said it directly in a published analysis this week. Operation Epic Fury is a military success funded by strategic risk. While direct attack weapons are plentiful, the conflict is steadily draining the scarce munitions, standoff, anti-ship, air defense, and counter-drone that the United States would need most in a war with China. Every additional week at high tempo deepens a deficit that the industrial base cannot quickly erase. Asia Times reported that the munitions drain may force the U.S. to divert stocks from the Pacific, potentially compromising military readiness against China to sustain ongoing operations in the Mediterranean and Persian Gulf. Iran, which shares no border with the Pacific and has no direct stake in the Taiwan question, has nonetheless, by forcing the United States to burn its Pacific deterrent stockpile in a Middle Eastern conflict, served the strategic interests of the one country that cares most about American vulnerability in that theater. The EU president said, "The only winner of this war is Russia." The Asia Times said China is watching as U.S. missile stocks drain. Both statements are true simultaneously. Iran is fighting. China and Russia are watching their primary adversary weaken. And then there is the economic warfare dimension, which is the layer of Iran's strategy that is doing damage not to military hardware, but to the financial foundations of American power. The Strait of Hormuz carries 20% of the world's oil and 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas every single day. Iran has mined it. Shipping traffic is down 95%. Qatar halted LG production after Iranian strikes on Ras Laffan. Goldman Sachs calculated that global LNG supply dropped by 19% almost overnight. Brent crude has swung between $87 and $126 in a single week. A level of volatility that makes long-term energy contracts impossible to price, that drives inflation expectations higher, and that creates a drag on economic growth that compounds every week the disruption continues. Chatham House estimates that a prolonged closure drives oil toward $130 per barrel, produces Eurozone contraction in the second quarter of 2026, and requires the European Central Bank to raise interest rates twice in the second half of the year to contain the resulting inflation. Neil Atkinson, the former IEA head of oil markets, described the situation with the clearest possible language. The sky's the limit. We are in a potentially game-changing and unprecedented energy crisis. The Rapidan Energy Group noted that the current disruption is more than double the previous record disruption to Hormuz traffic, which was set during the Suez Crisis of 1956 and 1957. More than double the previous record. And every additional day that Hormuz stays disrupted adds to the cumulative economic damage in ways that do not immediately reverse when the disruption ends. Supply chains that rerouted take time to reroute back. Insurance premiums that tripled do not immediately fall. Shipping contracts that were suspended rebuild trust slowly. The economic damage from this war will outlast the military phase by months or years. Now add the domestic American fiscal picture to everything else, because it is the factor that makes all the others worse. The United States government was already running a structural deficit of nearly $2 trillion per year before Operation Epic Fury began. The interest payments on the national debt are already exceeding $1 trillion annually. Trump had already asked Congress for a 50% increase in the defense budget, bringing it to $1.5 trillion before the first bomb fell. And now on top of all of that, the war is adding an estimated $1 billion per day in direct military costs, requiring a $50 billion emergency supplemental just for weapons replacement, driving a 60-cent jump in national average gas prices that reduces consumer purchasing power and complicates the inflation outlook, and threatening to add between $40 and $210 billion in total economic impact before it is over, depending on how long it lasts. The debt to GDP ratio of the United States is now at 122.8%, according to the Institute of International Finance, up from 119.9% just a year ago. National security experts across 8 Republican and Democratic administrations warned a decade ago that long-term debt is the single greatest threat to American national security. Iran does not need to build a weapon capable of matching an American aircraft carrier. It needs to find a way to force the United States to spend its way to strategic weakness. And the 3 and 63.1 cost ratio is how it does it. Every Shahed drone that forces a THAAD intercept turns 35,000 Iranian dollars into 12.7 million American ones at scale across thousands of drones launched over weeks or months. That is not warfare. It is a bank transfer from the United States Treasury to the structural weakening of American strategic capacity. And unlike a bomb, it leaves no crater that heals. It leaves a balance sheet entry that compounds. Here's the thing that the Atlantic Council's analysts said in their 20-question assessment of this war that deserves to be stated directly, because it describes what Iran's leadership has calculated with striking clarity. A slow, protracted war of attrition is probably Iran's intended outcome. Iranian leaders are calculating that their country is more willing to take casualties and absorb pain than either the United States or Gulf countries. Therefore, if Iran retains the military capability, including asymmetric threats to inflict pain on the United States and the Gulf, as well as keep energy prices high, then Iran is more likely to determine the end of the conflict than the United States is. Read that again. Iran is more likely to determine the end of the conflict than the United States is. That is the Atlantic Council, not Iranian state media, not an anti-war activist. The Atlantic Council, which has spent 30 years as one of Washington's most establishment-aligned foreign policy institutions, looking at the data from 12 days of this war and concluding that Iran's strategy positions it to determine the exit terms more effectively than the country that is bombing it. Because Iran has a population that has been living under economic siege for 40 years and has developed under that siege a tolerance for hardship that neither the American public nor the Gulf states that host American bases have ever been tested on at equivalent scale. 200 Iranian civilians are dead. Iranian internet is at 4% of normal. The rial has collapsed. Inflation was already over 40% before the war began. And the IRGC's public message to its population is not that this is a catastrophe. It is that this is exactly the sacrifice that was always required. That is a population being prepared for a long war. The Reuters Ipsos poll of Americans found that only 1 in 4 Americans supports the strikes on Iran, including only 1 in 4 Republicans. That is the population the United States government needs to sustain a long war. And those two populations, one prepared for years of sacrifice and one already at 25% support after 12 days, are not going to reach exhaustion at the same pace. The CNAS conclusion is the one that should be on the front page of every newspaper in the country. Every additional week at high tempo deepens a deficit that the industrial base cannot quickly erase. The Patriot missiles being fired over Kuwait come off the same production line that Taiwan is waiting for. The THAAD interceptors being consumed over Qatar come out of the same stockpile that was supposed to deter China. The Tomahawks being launched at Iranian air defense sites are Tomahawks that cannot simultaneously be positioned in the Pacific. Military resources are finite. The United States entered this war already stretched, already running a $2 trillion annual deficit, already carrying debt at 122% of GDP, already warning publicly that it was on the wrong side of the interceptor cost curve. Iran did not need to create those conditions. Those conditions already existed. Iran simply needed to find a war that would activate them. And it found one, or rather, one found it. The question that nobody in the buildings where these decisions are being made has answered publicly, and that the data demands be answered, is this: at what point does the cost of continuing this war exceed the cost of ending it? Not the human cost, though that is real and growing every day. The fiscal cost, the strategic cost, the cost in interceptor stockpiles that take 5 months to replace, the cost in Pacific deterrence that cannot be rebuilt quickly, the cost in debt service that will compound for a decade, the cost in economic disruption that will outlast the military phase by years. Iran has a plan for how this war ends. The plan involves making the cost of continuing it for the United States higher than the cost of stopping. And right now, by every piece of independent analysis available, that plan is working. Share this because the 363-to-1 ratio is not a military statistic. It is a description of how the most powerful country in the world is being slowly and methodically drained by a country that could not match it in a conventional fight and knew it. Share it because $210 billion of projected economic impact landing on top of a $2 trillion deficit and $38.5 trillion of national debt is not a footnote. It is the fiscal foundation of American power being eroded in real time. Share it because China is watching every THAAD interceptor that gets fired over Qatar. And the men in Beijing doing that watching are taking notes about what will be left to defend Taiwan when this is over, and share it because the only way any of this changes is if enough people understand what is actually happening. Not the story of American military dominance, the story of what dominance costs when the other side has designed an entire strategy around making you pay for